5.
It was a woeful performance, and I just thought Kemi should have sacked him immediately because he seemed to be exactly the sort of wet, useless person, completely out of touch with popular opinion.
4.
Kemi Badenoch has to be. She has to massively distance herself from previous Tory failing.
3.
So I spoke to Ray, Lucy's husband, who's a lovely plain-speaking Midlander, and Ray said, "Oh, I read that Sumption article." He said, "He seems like a stupid git."
2.
Keir Starmer sat there in the Oval Office and said, "We have a very proud history of free speech in this country." Yeah, a history, because we don't have it anymore.
1. We have liftoff.
Welcome once again to Planet Normal, the Telegraph podcast with Alison Pearson.
Hello.
And me, Liam Halligan. Only a very clever man like Lord Sumption could be so stupid when it comes to the Lucy Connelly case. So say you, Alison, your column in yesterday's Telegraph excoriating the former Supreme Court judge. Jonathan Sumption says that Northampton mum Lucy Connelly deserves to be in jail for 31 months for a nasty tweet she deleted a few hours later. You had plenty to say about that, Alison. In my view, rightly so. While Nigel Farage agrees with you on Connelly, he's shifting left on economics. The Reform leader wants to scrap the 2-child benefit cap, a cap some Reform voters will surely agree with. Keir Starmer, meanwhile, seems to be, quotes, spending money without his Chancellor's permission, also suggesting the 2-child limit on child benefit payments should go, while retreating from cost savings from the winter fuel payment, cuts already announced by Rachel Reeves herself. It's just 2 weeks until the government's much-contested spending review, Alison, and economic tensions across the Labour Party are increasingly clear. As the Chancellor tries to hold the line, refusing for now to ease Labour's fiscal rules to control spending, Starmer's pandering to his party's left, pressuring her to change them. And meanwhile, the bond markets of those gnomes of Zurich are watching, wondering if Labour have learnt to add up, or if they're going to stuff their ears with big spending ideological nostrums and drive the economy over a cliff. So much to discuss, Alison, and we've got a fabulous Planet Normal guest as well. But let's start with your response to Jonathan Sumption's view of the Lucy Connelly case. We're talking here, aren't we, about a former Planet Normal guest, someone we both deeply admire.
Well, we did, Liam, or I did. Look, I wasn't going to write about Lucy this week, because obviously I've written a lot, and we had the very disappointing appeal court result last week. So I wasn't going to raise the topic again. I think the campaign's been going very well. Telegraph been rowing in behind me. And as you say, Nigel Farage, Boris Johnson, lots of actually people, really good people speaking up and saying Lucy absolutely shouldn't be in jail. So then the Telegraph ran this piece by Lord Sumption. And as you say, someone who during lockdown became a kind of totemic figure for many of us as we tried to express our hostility to lockdown. And Sumption, of course, one of the great, brilliant legal minds, well, some would say the most brilliant legal mind of his generation, lent huge dignity and gravitas to the anti-lockdown case. And he spoke brilliantly about the threat to free speech and the authoritarian tendencies of the government during that era, being enforced by the spreading of fear. And so it was very disappointing, to say the least, to see this headline on the Telegraph, cite from Sumption, "I shall not waste any sympathy on Mrs. Connelly. She belongs in prison." And I don't know, I was questioning it, Liam. What was he doing? It seemed to me that his stated views on free speech, which he then went on in this article to talk about, one of my bête noire, the Orwellian non-crime hate incidents, which Sumption thinks are dreadful and have really no legal basis, which they certainly don't. They're an invention of the College of Policing, which I think are oppressive, and many people are being persecuted by these non-crime hate incidents. But I think his stance on free speech seemed to be then contradicted by his criticism, heavy criticism of Lucy Connelly for this single, really, as we've discussed on the podcast, unpleasant tweet. He didn't talk about the many mitigating factors with which Planet Normal listeners will be familiar. He sounded unbelievably callous. I mean, he may have been outlining the law, but this is a mother of a 12-year-old girl, obviously a woman of extremely good character who lost her own child in a horrifying circumstances of medical malpractice, leaving Lucy with PTSD. So there were many factors. So I was pretty annoyed and upset, as I think were well over 9,000 Telegraph readers registered their displeasure with Lord Sumption in the comments, which are often, we shouldn't say this, Liam, should we? But the Telegraph comments are often as illuminating, if not more illuminating, than the stuff we write above them.
Speak for yourself.
So I spoke to Ray, Lucy's husband, who's a lovely plain-speaking Midlander. And Ray said, I read that Sumption article. He said, he seems like a stupid git, which I thought was the first time that the former Supreme Court judge has been called a stupid git. Just to end, Liam, before I come to you, because I know you've got very strong views on this as well. Some of the stuff that I'm very privy to what's going on with Lucy. She's been able to communicate with me via Ray from prison. And also I was on the list of people she could telephone, and I was down as Auntie Judith. But what's happened now is she's in Drake Hall prison in Staffordshire. Lucy has been denied since November the types of leave from prison to which she is entitled, not only because she's been a model prisoner, but because she is legally entitled to come out either with a tag, wearing an electronic tag, or to this ROTL, ROTL, right of temporary leave. Now, it's been denied many times, despite probation officers saying to Lucy, we've never known anything like this. I've done 18 years in this job. I've never known anything like it. So this adds, I'm afraid, Liam, to the perception that Lucy Connelly is being made an example of, that she's a political prisoner to deter people challenging the government's sort of narrative on multiculturalism. And I just want to say to listeners that what's extremely disturbing fact that I found for the Connollys this week is that they said that in some of her phone calls from the prison, which are recorded, they said, you've been denied the right of temporary leave this time because you've expressed extreme views in your phone calls, which parallel your offence. And Lucy said, what on earth are you talking about? What have I said? And she was joking with me, Liam, that she'd call Keir Starmer a commie. But she said, surely that's not an extreme view. That's just what everybody thinks. Anyway, but the prison have backed down and said, yes, extreme views have now been modified to strong opinions. Lucy had expressed in her phone calls home strong opinions. And, it's quite chilling to me. This is a woman in prison, vulnerable woman in prison, who is being denied leave at home with her child. I don't want to go into details. She's a 12-year-old girl coming up through puberty, giving Ray a lot of hassle. The dad can't really cope with this girl who's missing mum.
Sure.
Very badly, incredibly upset. And these rights of leave, this isn't just some nice icing on the cake. This is used, Ian Aitchison, a prisons experts, told me, this is seen as preparation, a transition to prisoners coming out, right? So Lucy, this is what a system which believes in rehabilitation and humane treatment would normally be affording to a prisoner like this. Never mind a prisoner who has, in my view, done so little and should indeed never have pleaded guilty. And I'm absolutely convinced Lucy, if she'd come before a jury, would not have been convicted. But let me leave you with the idea that they are now, the prison authorities are basically coming up with, to me, absolutely clutching at straws, reasons why Lucy should be denied the leave to which she's entitled, because she's expressed a strong opinion in a phone conversation. It's absolutely chilling, don't you think?
I do, Alison. I do. And you quoted the conversation we had about George Orwell last week. And there are some ideas that are so stupid that only very intelligent people can believe them. And I am perturbed by not just the angle of attack that Lord Sumption's taken in his commentary on Lucy Connelly, but also his very, very uncharacteristically intemperate language. He's a master communicator. I shall not waste any sympathy on Lucy. Crikey.
Yeah.
A mum in jail for 31 months for a tweet. It just seems so disproportionate. And it does strike me, while you're not a lawyer, though you did get into university to do law, and you've obviously transformed yourself into a world-class economist in the last 3 months. So who cares about labels, huh?
Yeah.
In podcast world.
Is there no beginning to her talents?
Yeah, I do think that you have a better handle on public opinion regarding this case. And of course, we're talking about points of law, but public opinion is also important in the aftermath of a situation where the Prime Minister of the day has so clearly intervened with his rhetoric in the aftermath of the Southport tragedy, a tragedy during which it's clear the authorities were not telling us the whole truth, and we're trying to gild the lily about the realities of what actually happened in that ghastly case, which of course we've talked about endlessly on Planet Normal.
Yeah.
I think there's a sense here of the judiciary, even the great Lord Sumption is prone to this tendency, circling the wagons.
Yeah, absolutely.
Against the realities of the world. And I say that with regret. I hugely admire him. He was a giant during the lunacy of lockdown. And he was very personally important to both of us as we made our stand and took brickbats from all quarters. The fact that we had in our corner, probably the finest, most respected legal mind in Britain, and probably the most highly respected former head of British intelligence in the form of Richard Dearlove, telling us that we were completely right to be saying what we were saying and taking the professional risks that we did. So I do admire him. I just think in this case, he has badly misjudged things, and we're all, even the finest people. I say again, I think it's a shame that what he said, even the finest people are susceptible to lapses of judgment. I think it's a lapse of judgment in this case, as it was from, we must mention, Shadow Minister for Justice, Kieran Mullen MP.
Dear, oh dear.
Our mate Kevin O'Sullivan, Talk TV, never unknowingly not outraged. Brilliant broadcaster, along with Mike Graham, of course. Real kind of standing up for ordinary people and their views while both being superb journalists in their own right. Kevin O'Sullivan just could not contain himself when you had Kieran Mullen MP, Dr. Kieran Mullen on Talk TV as he did, because Kieran Mullen seemed to row back from what his own leader, Kemi Badenoch, had said, that Lucy Connelly should not be in prison. And he couldn't bring himself to say that. And Kevin was rightly outraged. Try opposing, mate. Try opposing.
Yes, he started using, when they start banding around words like proportionality, that's always a sign, isn't it? It was, it was a woeful performance. And I just thought Kemi should have sacked him immediately, because he seemed to be exactly the sort of wet, useless person, completely out of touch with popular opinion that the Tories don't need. I should say, Liam, that one good thing, which is coming from this campaign, is that I'm told that the prison authorities have been badly rattled by the Telegraph's coverage of Lucy's case. Good. They bloody well should be rattled. And I'm wondering now whether there will be any movement on allowing her to have some of this temporary leave, although they punished her again last week for press engagement. That's talking to your co-pilot. I mean,
and you go by the sobriquet Auntie Judith, don't
Auntie Judith, yes, she would ring up and say, "Hello, Auntie Judith," and I'd say, "Hello, Lucy." By the way, the Lucy crowdfunder, which I set up with Dan Wootton of Outspoken, we both championed Lucy, and that's edging up to £150,000 now, and means a huge amount to the Connollys, who have got into terrible debt, obviously burnt through their savings very quickly because of legal bills and all sorts. So if you still minded to give a little bit to help Lucy rebuild her life.
That is a two fingers up to Starmer, I think, from a lot of people who have donated. And Farage also is putting two fingers up to Starmer because, of course, he thoroughly backs your view on Lucy Connelly. Having said that, he's agreeing with Keir Starmer. We should move on to economics, your forte. Now you've bestrode the law, let's move on to the dismal science, as it were. Nigel Farage announcing in the last few days that a reform government, and that is, can we believe we're saying that? They are favourites on many betting sites to form the next government. a Reform government will scrap the two-child benefit cap, which is interesting to me, as well as keeping, we knew this already, their policy of raising the basic rate of income tax threshold from about 12.5 grand where it currently is to £20,000. So you won't pay income tax before £20,000. That is now going to come under a lot of scrutiny. I'm going to be writing about the maths of that 20 grand tax threshold pledge in the Telegraph this coming weekend, by the way. But on the child benefit cap, Starmer wants to do that too. I think a lot of Reform voters want a cap on child benefit because they'll be living in areas where there are people living next door with 3 or 4 kids who are living on benefits, while the alarm clock classes, which Nigel Farage calls them, are keeping themselves to 2 kids because they're not claiming benefits and they're feeling that they're hard done by. And now, of course, Starmer wants to do that, reversing his own government's policies, putting Rachel Reeves under pressure because this will cost money in order to pander to his left. How long before even the Tories want to scrap the two-child benefit cap as well in this kind of auction of ever higher welfare spending?
Well, it was George Osborne who brought it in, wasn't it, in 2017? Now, I think that this is a very surprising policy for Reform because it's not really what it sounds like. A couple of things to say before I get into the nitty-gritty. You'll be horrified to learn that this is my special subject. So if any Planet Normal listeners want to go and make a cup of tea, put the kettle on, come back in 10 minutes, I'll still be talking about working families.
Is this what I sound like when I go on about bond markets and quantitative easing?
I'm afraid.
Have you seen the 10-year yield? The 10-year yield is 4.7. I mean,
we speak of nothing else in the King's Arms. When people see Liam coming in and they're all shooting out the back to the toilets thinking, oh God, he's going to come in and chat about that again. So let's just say there's so the More in Common poll, we're recording this on Wednesday, absolutely astonishing. Reform on 31%, which would give them 368 seats. Labour on 22%. I mean, this is serious stuff now. This is 9 points behind. That would give Labour 126 seats. And the Tories down on 19% of 30 seats. I mean, have Reform peaked too early? We don't know, but these are quite astonishing numbers at the moment. I would say, Liam, that in Farage's speech, I found a lot to like. He talked about making the family a more important element in British life. Hear to that. And something I do like, and I've talked about for years, tax breaks for married couples. Because, as we know, if mum, or indeed dad, but often it's mum, elects to stay home and spend more time with the children, a couple is really penalised compared to a couple where both in work. So I agree with that. I agree with one spouse being spared from paying tax on the first 25 grand. I think that's a very sound policy which enables families to spend more time with children in those vital early years. And I know you'll have views on, raising the tax-free allowance to that 20,000, which someone has said would cost up to 80 billion. And also another policy I think is very good was raising, which Farage outlined, of raising the higher rate tax threshold from 50,270 to 70,000, because as we've often discussed on Planet Normal, these freezing of these tax thresholds has been dragging millions of not particularly wealthy people into the top rate. That's not what the top rate is designed for. And it's one reason that lots of British families are struggling with the cost of living, because they're being treated as top rate taxpayers. But just coming now to this two-child benefit cap, which Nigel Farage says that Reform would scrap. But as you say, Liam, so this two-child benefit cap, let's be clear, it doesn't mean child benefit, right? As we understand it, all parents can claim basic child benefit for all of their children. This refers to people on universal credit who can get thousands of pounds on top of that standard child benefit for their first 2 children. And the cap at the moment stops them getting even more money for 3rd, 4th, 5th child, and so on. Now, as we know, Liam, hardworking parents have to take prudent decisions, can we afford another baby? And when I speak to friends with young families, a couple of people I know, they have stuck at one child because childcare costs are so prohibitive, or none. If you've got 2 kids at nursery under the age of 4, that could easily be absorbing one parent's entire post-tax income.
Paying for the nursery out of post-tax income, of course.
Paying for the nursery.
Utter madness is it to tax young parents and then make them pay for childcare, which allows both of them to go to work out of their post-tax income. Insane.
This is disincentivizing. There are huge, I can bawl for Britain on this because I wrote a book, my first novel, I don't know how she does it, was about.
Was that you? You never mentioned it.
Yeah, that was me. I only sold 4 million copies. Have I mentioned that?
Yeah, Sarah Jessica Parker and Pierce Brosnan.
Translated into 32 languages.
Can I just say, Pierce Brosnan, who of course was in that film too, right? Pierce Brosnan, I can't believe it. I've been watching a bit of Mobland, right? Which is all about sort of dodgy Irish families in North London called the Harrigans. I'm not saying if they're modelled on my family or not. But I can't believe that Pierce Brosnan, who's actually Irish, right? His Irish accent is crap.
No, it's really.
It is. He sounds like an English person trying to be Irish. I should know.
He was very nice to me, was Pierce Brosnan.
I'm sure he was. And look, don't get me wrong. He's a really good actor. He's not
a wonderful actor.
Smoothie pants James Bond. I think he's a really good actor. I just don't know what's going on with his Irish accent.
I don't know how she does it. One of the lines that Kate, the heroine, says is that we were told we could have it all, right? Women could have it all. But that obviously was a lie. And she said, the problem is suddenly we're allowed to do our father's jobs, but we retained our mother's responsibilities. And the result is a very difficult double shift. Now, that remains true. And I think behind this falling birth rate, is a very, very serious demographic situation in our country now. Huge decline from the 60s. The total fertility rate in England and Wales last year was a record low of 1.44 children per woman. And that's more than halved since 1963. So a lot of women, particularly professional women, are trying to choose a good moment to start a family. And there doesn't tend to be one because, you've got your career and nobody can afford the deposit on a flat anymore. So you've got nowhere to put the baby, all those sort of pressures. But this is not addressed by this reform policy. The danger, as you say, is that it risks rewarding people who are not making prudent choices. So Robert Jenrick actually pointed out that before the 2-child cap was introduced in 2017, there were scores of workless families with 10 or more children living on state benefits that were worth more than £60,000 a year, Liam. Much more money than they could hope to earn if they actually went out to work. So I think that can lead to bitterness. Why has that family down the road got more money, me and the missus or whatever, we're working our asses off. And yet if they produce more children than they're on benefits, you can sort of, cash in on that. So this doesn't seem to me, as you say, it doesn't seem to me to be a natural reform policy for the alarm clock classes.
Yeah.
And I know that they're trying to address this demographic problem. We do need couples to have more children, but I think that there are other policies, and I would certainly cite that tax breaks for married couples, particularly with one parent staying home, and looking at some way to drive down childcare costs as well.
I think there's a lot in that, Alison, and I think on the bigger picture, there's something happening in British politics where spending pledges are now being thrown about like confetti. You have reform upping the ante. Farage is a very, very shrewd political operator, as is Richard Tice. They are doing something that's going to cost a lot of money. Their £20,000 tax threshold policy, something I've been advocating for years and years.
Yeah, you have, haven't you?
I don't think it's going to cost 80 billion for reasons I'll be explaining in the Telegraph this weekend. I think it'll be a lot less than that because I don't think Whitehall and others are modelling the fact that if you put the threshold up, a lot of people will come off benefits.
Yes.
And they will then be generating all kinds of wealth in the economy and spending more
Good point.
VAT and so on.
Yeah.
So I don't think those numbers are as bad for that policy. But I do think Starmer and reform now, as Farage parks his tanks on Labour's lawn, which he did last week, they are going to start trading spending pledges with Starmer very much to the left of his Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, and scapegoating her. And I didn't think I'd start feeling sorry for Rachel Reeves anytime soon, but I do, without wishing to be unchivalrous. I do, because she is trying to hold some kind of line, and Starmer just keeps saying things that cost lots of money. And is she being consulted or not? I don't know. No one in the Treasury can stand up whether or not she's being consulted beyond sort of public-facing platitudes. But as I wrote last weekend in my column, link in the show notes to this episode, I think Labour in general have got this kind of Blackadder approach to economic policy making.
Yeah.
It's Lord Melchett, Stephen Fry's Lord Melchett, who said to Rowan Atkinson, if nothing else works, a total pig-headed unwillingness to look facts in the face will see us through. And I think that's what Labour are doing. And the facts in the face, and, strap yourself in, because I'm going to mention the bond market again.
Oh, here we go.
There will come a point, Alison, where you'll be quoting 10-year bond yields in your all-encompassing column in the Telegraph. We're now up at 4.7%, right? The government is paying to borrow money for 10 years. That's up from 3.7, Alison, in September, before the October budget. That is a huge proportionate increase. And during that period, I say again, the Bank of England has been cutting base interest rates. So the markets and the Bank of England policymakers are going in completely the opposite directions, which is not good. It points to systemic dangers. And, if reform are going to go gung-ho on big spending economics, and who cares about the bond markets, if they're going to do that, which kind of surprises me if they are going to do that, because Tice and Farage are two of the most financially literate politicians I know. But if that is their public-facing shtick, if you like, that we're going to spend lots of money on red wall voters, then the Tories just have to hold the line. They have to become the party of economic responsibility. It could be an opportunity for the Tories. It could be an opportunity, warning that financial markets are now raising very serious eyebrows in the direction of British politicians and policymakers. And, you're right. This isn't the stuff people talk about in pubs until they do talk about it in pubs. No one was talking about, credit default swaps and the subprime crisis before March 2008, Alison, even though people like me were writing about it. And then suddenly everyone was talking about it because you'd had some kind of systemic lurch. Economics and finance has a habit of it's like the submarine of politics, right? It's just under the water. We know it's there. It poses danger. It's just under the water. And then it fires a torpedo or it surfaces and everything changes. And that is my concern. And I don't apologize for returning to it. That what's happening on bond markets is worrying. And it is the talk of informed financial circles. But they're not going to gob on about it because they're going to make money out of it instead. So the few of us, who talk about politics as well, who actually get this stuff, we just have to speak out about it. And that includes you, co-pilot, world-class economist that you are.
Look, clearly what Labour aren't talking about is cuts, which we're looking at Rachel, no doubt more coming back, breaking her own promise and indeed Starmer's promise. So we're not going to have any more tax rises for working people, because if they won't slash this just giant benefits bill, it's absolutely insane. But Farage, to his credit, hang on a minute, that's one of my post-it notes. By the end of the decade, welfare spending is forecast to reach £378 billion. I mean, we're not going to have much money left for anything, are we really? But the issue is that Farage did talk about that there are savings to be made. So scrapping net zero, that would save a lot of money. And he's also talking about the huge costs of illegal immigration and so on. So he was outlining savings. Now, the Conservatives have accused reform of fantasy economics. And from what you're saying, yes, there may be some truth in that. But the fact is that a party which is responsible really for running the national debt up to almost £3 trillion is not really on secure ground accusing anybody else.
But she has to be. Kemi Badenoch has to be. She has to massively distance herself from previous Tory failings. She massively has to distance herself from members of her party, including in Parliament, who don't back her on this. Just as Tony Blair did when he came in opposition. He had his clause 4 moments. He deliberately picked fights with the left of his party in order to demonstrate to swing voters in the centre ground that he understood that they were wrong and he was right and voters were right. And that's what she has to do as well, because it may turn out that the Greens, Labour, the Lib Dems, obviously, big state spenders, the Lib Dems, every part, the SNP, obviously, very statist party, every political party represented in Parliament is going to just be saying, spend more, we can, and then you'll get all the nonsense. Let's just print more money, and the markets will give our political or media class a massive whack round the head with a baseball bat, and ordinary people will suffer enormously. It happened in 1976. It almost happened again, a systemic lurch on equity markets in 2008. The danger signals are there, Alison, and we have to heed them.
It is, though, Liam, proving very difficult for her to distance herself from that poisonous legacy. And with these very, very bad poll ratings for the Tories, the drumbeat of doom now surrounding Kemi Badenoch, can she survive? That drumbeat is getting louder. We've just had Dominic Cummings saying that Kemi will be ousted as Tory leader this year. I'm not sure I'd be that pessimistic, but certainly the May local elections next year are going to be an absolute crisis point for her if she's still in post. I should say that, she was my choice for Tory leader. I think a lot of it's not her fault. It's this legacy of a Conservative party, see no Conservatives in name only. And as you say, she is now going to have to pick some very serious fights with some of the Lib Dems in her ranks.
Now on to our Planet Normal guest. Andrew Doyle's a playwright, journalist, stand-up comedian and political satirist. He's operated in the media front line, having hosted his own Free Speech Nation show on GB News and on the same channel, creating the late-night Headliners newspaper review. Andrew also created the fictional character Titania McGrath on social media, which he used to lampoon critical race theory, trans activism and other so-called woke tendencies. And he helped to set up the comedy Unleashed Network too. But Andrew Doyle is also a serious scholar. Having been visiting research fellow at Queen's University Belfast, he holds a doctorate in early Renaissance poetry from Oxford University. He's an accomplished writer too, the author of Free Speech and Why It Matters in 2021 and The New Puritans, How the Religion of Social Justice Captured the Western World in 2022. Andrew Doyle last appeared on Planet Normal in October, when Alison and I interviewed both him and the political satirist Frank Furedi at the Battle of Ideas Festival. Since then, Andrew's written a new book, The End of Woke, which is published today, Thursday, the 29th of May. When The New Puritans came out in 2022, Andrew told me that was to be his last word on the culture wars. So I started by asking him, what's changed?
Yeah, I was absolutely convinced it would be. But of course, what happened was an awful lot, actually, over the few years following 2022, but following that publication of that book. And my initial idea was to maybe reissue the paperback with a new introduction that sort of brought people up to speed. And I soon realized too much has happened. The world's gone even crazier than anyone anticipated in 2022. So it had to be a whole other book, I'm afraid. But this will be the last word, my last word on the culture war. That's my aim. That's why I've called it The End of Woke. It's more a kind of optimistic way so that I don't have to write another one. That's what I'm thinking.
I'm a kind of, an observer of the woke debate. Of course, we deal with these kind of issues on Planet Normal tangentially. It's hard to ignore them. Anyone that's interested in journalism, in free speech and society as a whole.
Yes.
And I kind of figured that someone soon would write a book, The End of Woke, because I watched the Cass report happen. I watched Wes Streeting come in and really change his tune and outlaw the use of puberty blockers, certainly within the NHS. I watched Donald Trump, a Republican president, sign those executive orders. Just talk Planet Normal's audience through that. Why you think the end of woke is accelerating and what really drove you to write this book now?
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting you mentioned that because, I think these woke issues affect everyone and sometimes whether people realize it or not, and it's absolutely everywhere. But the signs are all there, exactly as you say. So many kind of seismic moments have occurred over the last couple of years, which have really accelerated what I think is the death of woke in terms of the death of whatever woke was over the last 15 years. I mean, we can come on to what might happen next. But if you think about the various things that have happened, you've got Donald Trump signing this slew of executive orders, many of which are about preserving women's rights. The idea of no men in women's prisons, no men in women's sports, that kind of thing. This is a man who's been accused repeatedly of misogyny, but he's signing these orders to protect some of the most pro-feminist orders that any president has signed. So that's all happened over in America. And at the same time, you've had the stripping back of DEI policies, diversity, equity, and inclusion policies throughout the corporate sector, throughout the corporate world. Companies such as McDonald's and Walmart and Google and Facebook have all stripped all of this back in a very rapid time frame. And then at the same time, you've had, as you mentioned, the Cass review, which pointed out through 4 years of rigorous study that there is no evidence for the efficacy of puberty blockers for gender-confused children, resulting in Wes Streeting doing an about turn on his position on this, the banning of puberty blockers wholesale in the UK, something which will doubtless trickle out globally. And of course, very recently, we've had the Supreme Court ruling clarifying that in the Equality Act, the word sex means biological sex and that cannot change, even if you have a certificate that creates the legal fiction that you are the opposite sex. So all of this stuff, these things were sort of unimaginable if you go back 5-6 years, and particularly to that moment in 2020, in the summer of 2020, when wokeness hit its peak following the death of George Floyd and the pandemic and the lockdowns. And you had
the Black Lives Matter movement, and you had Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner taking the knee. You had police taking the knee when faced with some pretty belligerent protesters and so on.
Yes, and it really did escalate. Of course, since then, many key figures in the Black Lives Matter movement have been completely discredited. Many of the leaders of various chapters of BLM were found to have taken a lot of that money that was donated by people in good faith and bought luxury properties. Millions and millions of dollars. We've also seen the Chicago chapter of BLM putting out a pro-Palestine message on social media, which included an image of one of the terrorists from the 7th of October 2023, one of the paragliders. So,
beyond the pale. Completely beyond the pale.
So people have woken up to it. So all of that, and also the Economist did a study about this, which I quote in the book, about how wokeness sort of really kicked off in 2015, peaked around 2020, and has been declining ever since. And that decline, as far as I can see, is now pretty much terminal based on the factors I've just mentioned. And even the little things, like arch leftists like Ocasio-Cortez, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Pete
AOC,
Buttigieg,
as she's known, very left-wing US Democrat politician.
People like her have been taking their pronouns out of their social media bios, just doing it on the quiet, not making too much of a fuss about it, sometimes claiming it was a mistake. I noticed that Sadiq Khan removed his pronouns, and then there was a backlash. He put them back in and said it was just some kind of typo, as though someone hadn't deliberately got into his account.
Pathetic.
It's absolutely pathetic.
Do it or don't do it. God.
Yeah. But what I would say is all of this stuff suggests that woke is dying in its current form. The title of the book, The End of Woke, there's a kind of implied question mark there, but also it's a kind of aspiration rather than a prophecy. I'm not positioning myself as a kind of Nostradamus figure because I'd definitely get it wrong if I tried. So that's where I'm coming from. I think all the signs are there. We can hear all the death rattles. I don't think that woke as we knew it is going to come back. I think it's done a lot of damage. And I think that's why we're sort of staggering through the debris of this culture war now to try to sort of restore sanity. And that process will take a while, many years probably, but at least all of the key factors of woke are being sort of gradually discredited and leaving us with some semblance of normality.
A lot of these things come from the US, don't they? I know you're a very keen observer of the US, as am I. I know you're now living in the US a lot of the time, but it really struck me in your book where just as a lot of these kind of woke tendencies came from America, I think the end of woke has come from America too. When you wrote Trump's victory over Kamala Harris shows that woke can win and lose elections, and the Republicans came up with a really, really penetrating campaign slogan, Kamala is for they, them, President Trump is for you. And I think it was one of the most effective political slogans of all time, really tapping into how ordinary Americans feel, because even though so many of our media and political institutions and our corporations have slavishly pandered to this stuff, both in the States and here, the vast majority of people, ordinary people, have never had any truck with it at all. Repeated polls show that, and Trump really tapped into that.
Absolutely. That's why I've very little time for the argument that the culture war is imaginary, that it doesn't have anything to do with politics or elections. Actually, the culture war wins and loses elections. And we've seen that time and again. I mean, we saw, even if you go back to Hillary Clinton, I mean, when she lost, she had very much positioned herself as a candidate that would appeal to various demographics according to group identity. And that completely backfired. The example you mentioned, I mean, Kamala Harris had specifically said that prison inmates who identified as transgender should have access to surgery. That was what the advert, Kamala is for they, them, President Trump is for you. That's how that came about. And the group Future Forward, which was a Democratic Party group, and not a fan of Trump, admitted that advertisement triggered a 2.7 shift in favor of Trump among
absolutely
people who saw
seismic in an election that was on a knife edge until that point.
Exactly.
It probably delivered him his so-called triple victory, didn't it? Because he won the electorate, he won the majority vote, if you like. He won in the Senate, and he won in the Electoral College as well.
Exactly. The leader of the free world is there quite explicitly on an anti-woke mandate. Now, that means it does matter. And we can pretend it doesn't matter all we like. And, you've had various columnists saying, if you just ignore this, it'll go away. I know Matthew Parris made that point.
Insane.
It's not true.
He's a really bright man. I've got a lot of respect for him and his writing. I mean,
so
what's happened?
Yeah, so do I.
When really, really smart people, very politically astute, obviously worked at the top of politics, worked closely with Margaret Thatcher. Why?
Well, it's like when people say, cancel culture doesn't exist. And, in my book, as you know, I've deliberately listed sort of a long list of examples of people who've had reputations and livelihoods destroyed simply for saying things that we all know to be true. So, the denial is something that I think is very aggravating for people, because obviously there's been a culture war. Obviously, wokeness has prevailed in all of the major institutions, whether it be political or corporate or in the media or in the arts, where it completely reigns. So we can all see this. But you see, we've been constantly told that this stuff isn't real, that we're just imagining it. The phrase they use is gaslighting, But of course it's real. And of course it's destroyed lives. I mean, the woke movement has utterly destroyed individuals. We had in this country, the NHS medicalizing young people who were gender non-conforming. Kids who weren't adhering to outmoded 1950s stereotypes of what it meant to be male or female. They were being told they had a gendered soul and that they needed their body to be realigned to match that gendered soul. This is complete pseudoscience. It was, let's be honest, a kind of gay conversion therapy, because we know that between 80 and 90% of adolescents referred to the Tavistock Pediatric Clinic were same-sex attracted. That was confirmed by Hannah Barnes' study into the Tavistock Clinic. That is, in other words, fixing, heterosexualizing kids, almost certainly likely, most of whom will grow up to be gay. Yeah. That is the kind of gay conversion therapy that the mullahs of Tehran would absolutely applaud, but it was going on the NHS. To say none of this matters, it must be either willfully blind, or it might be to do with the fact that woke ideologues are so scary. I mean, they're frightening people. You want to put them on a leash. They're terrifying. And if people speak out about this, I mean, we've had a situation, if you think about it, Liam, for the past 10 years, where people have been scared to say online that no human being has ever changed sex, which is a matter of incontestable fact. Yeah. But we've been expected to say phrases like trans women are women. In other words, 2 + 2 = 5. And if we don't go along with that, we're monstered and demonized. And there is a genuine risk that people lose their careers. So to say it's not there.
Well, look at Robert Winston. Look at Robert Winston, one of the most respected sort of TV scientists, if you like. He's now a member of the House of Lords, Labour peer. He's basically banned from the BBC for years because he said it on Question Time. Do you remember?
I remember.
He said on Question Time, "You cannot change sex." And everyone went, "Oh my God, oh my God."
Yes.
And he literally has barely been on the telly since.
Fiona Bruce.
A brilliant man that we grew up with.
Yes, and you have the host sort of saying, well, a lot of people would find that offensive, etc. I mean, it's like he's just stated the existence of gravity.
Yeah.
And people reacted in horror. Well, because it is the woke movement was always rooted in these sort of quite quasi-religious ideas. And it became a kind of heresy to dissent. We're emerging from that now. I mean, I think one of the reasons why Wes Streeting has had such a turnaround on this is that
Health Secretary, of course.
The Health Secretary. Is that he has sat down and spoken to various campaign groups. He's talked to, I don't know exactly who he's spoken to, but people like Sex Matters and people like LGBT Alliance who are explaining why women's rights and gay rights are predicated on the recognition that biological sex is real.
Yeah.
And you can't really, once you've had that debate, once you've had that discussion, it's almost impossible actually to come out with any other conclusion than the truth. This is why, of course, when Stonewall, which is what used to be the country's foremost gay charity, and veered into trans ideology around 2015, their mantra has been no debate. They've said we're not debating this, because if you debate, you lose. If you have an insecure position like that, like, sex is a spectrum, sex doesn't exist, and also we should reorganize society according to some esoteric notion of a gendered soul rather than the reality of sexual difference and sexual dimorphism, you're onto a losing battle there, aren't you? If you actually allow the discussion. It's why people like Nadia Whittome in the Labour Party called debate a fetish. She said we mustn't fetishize debate. She's one of those who bought in wholesale.
And she's been elected to the mother of all parliaments. And she said, let's not fetishize debate.
Exactly. Well, what are you doing in Parliament then?
Absolutely
what are you doing
mad.
in the House of Commons then?
Absolutely mad. Absolutely mad. What advice would you have, Andrew, for opposition MPs, given that woke can win or lose elections, given, as you demonstrate, woke in some ways delivered Trump his second term in the White House? Kemi Badenoch's got a good track record on this. Of course, she commissioned the Cass review. I know the people around her and they're nervous about always being involved with these culture war issues. What would you say to her? What would be your advice under this heading?
I would say, firstly, don't be afraid of addressing these issues. You can ignore the people who say it doesn't matter. You can ignore what you can say is you can look at the statistics. More in Common initiative, who I quote in the book. They found that in the UK, it's only 8%, roughly between 8 and 10%. Of the country have supported woke ideas at any given time, at its height, in fact. And then what that means is that woke has never been popular with the electorate. And not only that, it's never been popular with any age bracket in the electorate. This has been a top-down ideology imposed by elites. It has a tendency, it works kind of like a virus, and it captures positions of power in government and in quangos and in the NHS and in the police. Look at the College of Policing. I mean, the College of Policing is now a kind of activist body that trains police officers in England and Wales, and it introduced that notion of non-crime hate incidents back in 2015.
Which, of course, are close to Alison's heart.
Well, of course, exactly. And that was introduced without a government mandate. There have since been 2 Home Secretaries that have told them, you cannot do this, stop it, and they ignored them. The High Court said, you cannot do this, stop it. They ignored the High Court because activist capture is very real. And so I would say to politicians, just remember how deeply unpopular these woke initiatives are with the general public. So if you want to win elections, we're in a democracy after all, then take a firm stance against it, because it ultimately it will be a pleaser. Well, the problem you're going to get is that people in positions of power are going to tell you that you have to go along with this stuff. Let's not forget, for all the culture war has been misunderstood as left versus right, the worst excesses of the woke movement were presided over by the Tories in their tenure. So this is something that
they set up the College of Policing, didn't they?
They did. They absolutely. So it's not something that can be, you can't vote it out. If it captures both major political parties, this was something that was never there because of a democratic mandate. And so it's been hard to get rid of. And the way it's dying now is, well, partly through Trump. I mean, that kind of revolution there in America. We don't have that equivalent yet here. but also just having the argument, having the discussion, and having politicians within those major parties, people like Kemi, people like Wes Streeting, who have the guts to say, actually, this is wrong. And that's what I would say, because I know politicians are always after the vote, aren't they? This is a popular thing to do. And it's not frivolous. If you speak to people whose lives have been ruined by this,
so many ordinary working people, so many ordinary working, men, particularly white men, feel that their careers are being constrained. They're not getting jobs because of this stuff. Sort of DEI on speed is really working against meritocracy. There's so many things I want to ask you, Andrew, and we're rapidly running out of time. I have to ask you just briefly, what do you think of the Lucy Connelly case? And why is it that you think Keir Starmer, as you've said, is authoritarian?
Well, as you know, I've written about the Lucy Connelly case in the book, and I know that Allison, of course, has been very close to this. She's been just the best on this topic. The problem here is manifold, but let's start with the point that the police and the government, the state, should not be auditing people's emotions, their speech and their thoughts. This was a tweet that was written hastily and deleted almost as quickly, just after a few hours. I know of nobody who defends the content of the tweet. I don't know anyone who says, I support what she said. The point isn't that. The point is that it doesn't, by any sensible definition of the term, qualify as incitement to violence. We in this country...
Do you think politicians put their finger on the scales of justice? You're a very experienced guy in the public sphere. You're politically extremely astute in my experience. Do you think that happened?
Yes, I think it was unofficial pressure. Keir Starmer appeared on television and said, I'm expecting substantive sentences by the end of the week.
Yeah.
When the Prime Minister does that, there is some kind of unofficial pressure being applied. And we know that it happened because the various judges in various of these cases who were meting out draconian jail terms for tweets and memes. I mean, there was even that guy who got 8 weeks in prison for memes that, as far as I can see, don't even meet the threshold of hate speech, whatever the hell that is.
Just to explain, a meme is like a sort of a little kind of cartoony thing on social media with a little slogan.
Yeah, it's an online image. I mean, the worst of the 3 memes that this guy posted was an image of immigrants with the slogan, coming to a town near you. I think immigrants with knives or something. Now, you might say that's unpleasant. You might say it's needlessly provocative. The idea that that should be illegal is terrifying to me, because Keir Starmer sat there in the Oval Office and said, we have a very proud history of free speech in this country. Yeah, history, because we don't have it anymore. No one should be in prison for something they say. In America, firstly, they have the First Amendment, which protects them to a degree. They also have a sensible definition in law of incitement to violence, which is known as the Brandenburg test. And the key aspects of the Brandenburg test are that there was an intention to incite violence, that violence was likely to occur due to the language, and that there was an imminent threat of violence. In none of those 3 criteria does Lucy Connelly's case apply. It was just an angry tweet written by someone thoughtlessly, rash in the moment, deleted. No violence occurred as a result of that tweet, and no violence could ever have occurred as a result of that tweet, because Lucy Connelly wasn't someone in a position of power. She wasn't some political leader. She had zero clout. And we know that the public doesn't act on cue according to stuff they consume in the media, whether that be in books or film or now online and on social media. So there was never any risk. She has been made an example of. And what troubled me as well in that case, the judge in the case made a specifically political statement in his judgment. He said, this is a country that has always valued diversity and inclusion. That's hat tipping to DEI. That's explicitly ideological. There's no getting around that. So that means that has, by his own admission, influenced the decision in some way or another. Now, all of this is very, very troubling. There's a man called Philip Prescott, who you will have heard of, who was sentenced to 28 months in prison for actually being part of a mob that physically attacked a mosque. Why is it that someone like Lucy Connelly talking about burning down a hotel is sentenced to longer than a man who actually physically attacks a mosque? That doesn't make any sense at all, but it makes complete sense when you understand that the woke ideology has infected our judicial system and our policing system, because they believe that words trump violence, that words are a form of violence and are actually sometimes worse than violence. These are postmodernists. They believe that our entire understanding of reality is constructed through language, and therefore censorship is the key to a cohesive society. Control what people say, and therefore you can sort out all of society's problems. That's their view.
That is literally Orwellian, isn't it? And you write about
Yes.
Orwell a lot in the book. I have to say, you're a man of many hats. You're obviously a stand-up comic. You created the incredibly successful Twitter account Titania McCraw, completely hilarious way of lampooning woke, way ahead of your time. You're a political street fighter. You got a doctorate in Renaissance poetry from Oxford. And I felt reading the book, as I said to you, I read it very, very quickly because it was such a good read, that there's endless references to Orwell, to John Milton, all kinds of philosophical references that you bring in. But just finally, please tell listeners of Planet Normal the incredible story of J.K. Chesterton and the flying in. It's as if he wrote it last week.
Oh, absolutely. So, well, this is a novel that was written in 1914. And the thing is, I've spoken to fans of G.K. Chesterton who don't know.
We are the people of England, of course, and we haven't spoken yet. It's probably his most famous quote.
Right. People don't know of this novel. It's one of those that, you know how when someone is so prolific, they write many novels and occasionally one of them just slips onto the net. So Chesterton wrote this book, The Flying In 1914. It is a tale about a future Islamic England. It's a story about an imam called the Prophet of the Moon, comes to the UK and manages to influence a major political figure, a man called Lord Ivywood, who's very powerful in Parliament. It's a bit hazy on the details of how this works, but effectively what happens for the comic premise.
It's a farce, isn't it? None of them can get a drink.
It's really, really silly. It's about how, because of the Islamic Sharia codes, no one can get a drink. Everyone's got to be teetotal. And these two guys discover a loophole in the law whereby you can sell beer if you've got the inn sign. So they run around the country on the back of a donkey with their barrels of beer and a wheel of cheese. And they plant their inn sign at various places, hence the flying in, sell their beer and move on. So I have to be clear, it's a satire. It's foolish. It's farcical. It's funny. But the point of it is he's talking about what happens when people in positions of power allow in deeply illiberal qualities into their democracy. It's a satire really on Lord Ivywood and that kind of politician.
And they kowtow because they don't want to cause offence.
Well, he's like the prototype of the virtue signaller.
Yeah.
He's, in the book, he says how he did not care for dogs, but he cared for the cause of dogs. It's things like that. And it's through the stupidity of the ruling class. That's what Chesterton really satirizes. He has this imam, this Prophet of the Moon, having these events in the London circuit of socialites. And there's a group called the Society of Simple Souls, just these posh upper middle class political people who love him and bring him in. And they say,
written last week. It's absolute genius.
Well, we've got, over 80 Sharia courts in this country. We have halal
and no one
meat.
wants to talk about it. No one wants to talk about it.
So it's funny that this book, written over 100 years ago, I mean, it's incredible to think about it, imagines this future Islamic England. It does it through the lens of comedy, but it has a lot to say. There's really silly things like Parliament votes to change the voting system so you don't put a cross in the polling booth, you put a crescent, so it's more Islamic than Christian. Silly things like that. But I think it's prescient. I think there's all sorts of ways in which we've allowed a kind of parallel system through this creed of multiculturalism to flourish. And that is exactly what Chesterton is satirizing in The Flying In. It's well worth a read.
Jesters do oft prove prophets.
They do.
As we read in King Lear. I can't match you for literary references, Andrew. It's a fabulous book. I can't recommend it highly enough. And it's indeed published today, the 29th of May, as Planet Normal is released. Andrew Doyle, the author of The End of Woke. Thanks so much for appearing once again on The Rocket of Right Thinking.
Really appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
There you go, Alison. Andrew Doyle, much admired by Planet Normal listeners and ourselves. Andrew's now spending most of his time in the States, and he's working on a sitcom with someone else I admire greatly, Graham Linehan, the celebrated comedy writer, cancelled, of course, for standing up for sex-based rights, if you like, as we must say in the vernacular. They're now in the States working with collaborators. They're writing their own sitcom, and more power to their elbow.
And Graham actually being dragged into court as if he hasn't suffered enough with losing his brilliant comedy career. I really loved this book, The End of Woke. As well as being such a clever person, Andrew is that lovely thing when you're a reader. He's a good companion on the page, isn't he, Liam?
Beautiful prose.
Beautiful prose, but also, lively and funny. And I think that he draws some very interesting distinctions. He says that woke wasn't really about left and right. It's really about liberal versus authoritarian. And funnily enough, it was the extreme left that became so authoritarian and indeed bullying to try and enforce its creed. And the reason, as Andrew said to you, is because there was actually very little popular support for a lot of this nonsense. And so it had to be done with the ruthless, no debate, anyone who doesn't use the correct pronoun and so on is going to be cancelled. And I think he does make his case very well. But the one thing I'm not sure about, Liam, to be honest, is it the end of woke? Listeners know I've been delving into the police after my own Remembrance Day encounter with the police on my doorstep, now pursuing a legal action against the police to try and flush out this kind of dreadful behaviour, persecuting broadly innocent people. Do you remember the recent retired volunteer police officer, Julian Fuchs, who was accused of having Brexity things on his bookshelf?
6 coppers to contain an OAP in his own home.
6 coppers. So that,
It'd be nice if they visited people who've been burgled in their own home.
Come, Halligan. Where would that end? They might have to arrest people who have done bad things and send them to prison, and there's no space in the prisons because Lucy Connelly's in there. I am not as optimistic as Andrew that we're coming to the end. I think that this pernicious ideology has got its tentacles into many of our institutions. And I was talking only this week to a quite senior police officer about the sort of anti-racism program all of his lot were being made to go on, which he just said was just dreadful, really. The usual white people are awful. Here are some ethnic minorities we can police in favour of. So I think it's going to take more, although many of the breakthroughs that Andrew cites and you and he talked about with Hilary Cass report, puberty blockers banned and so on, several important victories, not least to the amazing Scottish women and Kathleen Stock and Maya Forstater, who have won these important victories in the trans debate. But what I see myself, I'm afraid, is a lot of woke still in places it shouldn't be. Imagine saying to the guys in the Sweeney, Liam, that coppers would have fallen foul of this fundamentalist liberal creed. It is quite astonishing.
I love the Sweeney reference, a bit of Dennis Waterman and John Thor. I thought it was a fabulous book. I think that came across. Andrew Doyle is a tremendous street fighter. I love his literary allusions, but he doesn't just quote august people to show that he's clever. He actually brings their quotes alive and tells you why their quotes are important. He does it so beautifully. Such a learned man. I love the E.M. Forster quote at the top of his book. If you don't like people, put up with them as well as you can. Don't try to love them. You can't. You'll only strain yourself, but try to tolerate them. On the basis of that tolerance, a civilized future may be built. But final word, Alison, on this. I do agree with you. Maybe he's a bit premature. Andrew Doyle is a tremendous trend spotter, but maybe he is a bit too early. The End of Woke. It's the great title for a book, but maybe he should have added a question mark. Now on to our listener emails. Your messages sent to planetnormal@telegraph.co.uk. Please keep them coming. We'll learn so much from you, the citizens of Planet Normal.
We've had an absolute flood of correspondence about Lucy Connelly, and in response, Liam, to my request that female listeners wrote in, lots of women listeners have heard my plaintive cry. Sue says, hello to everyone at Planet Normal. What a devastating blow to Lucy Connelly and her family that she lost her appeal. Even after Alison's excellent journalism and the help of the Free Speech Union, you would think that the powers that be would be embarrassed not to show some mercy. What a shameful state of affairs, says Sue. When my blood boiled with rage during the COVID response, which is when I found Planet Normal, I too said some highly questionable things about certain politicians, the only difference being that I said them to my partner in the privacy of the car or home. It is obvious that Lucy found herself in a very low place emotionally after the Southport massacre and thought better of what she had said a few hours later, but it was already too late. Given her backstory, she really should have been given nothing more than a caution. I found an interesting barrister on YouTube, says Sue, Daniel Shen Smith. I know of him, Sue, and he's called the Black Belt Barrister. Highly recommended to Planet Normal listeners, by the way. And Daniel Shen Smith has posted his legal thoughts on Lucy Connelly versus the system, talking about how she was very harshly treated. And Pauline says, Dear Allison and Liam, here's a letter from a female listener as requested. Thank you, Pauline. Wow, you've done the most amazing work, Allison, in highlighting the terrible injustice suffered by Lucy Connelly. If ever there was a case where the punishment did not fit the crime, this is it. I loved your assessment of judges being, quotes, clever, stupid men. I was only saying to my other half, says Pauline, that when I was teaching, it was no good having an intelligent child if they couldn't apply their intelligence correctly, and my job was to help them do that. The same goes for the clever, stupid judges. They may be highly intelligent, but they've never learnt how to apply that intelligence with compassion, fairness, understanding, common sense, true justice and wisdom. And that gift of intelligence is useless. They end up being intellectual, arrogant buffoons who could do great damage. We're having our freedom slowly chipped away as we slide down a dangerous, slippery slope. Lucy Connelly is, to my mind, without doubt, a political prisoner. Politicians have used their power unwisely, I believe, to influence the judiciary. They need to take note of Tony Benn's great words. What power have you got? Where did you get it from? In whose interest do you exercise it? To whom are you accountable? And how can we get rid of you? Sooner rather than later, please, says Pauline. Keep up the fantastic work. Clever, intelligent, wise, Liam and Allison. Every Thursday morning, the first thing I do when I get into the car is switch on the new episode of Planet Normal so I'm ready to face this crazy world once again. Best wishes, Pauline. Thank you, Pauline.
This is from Sheila, another of our Amazonian warrior email writers. Dear Allison and Liam, thanks for yet another brilliant episode of Planet Normal, along with your exemplary interview with Lord David Frost. I, like many others, am absolutely horrified with our re-entry into the EU, which this reset is, says Sheila. I can remember that after I heard we'd voted to leave, I said, as long as the politicians don't muck it up. How had that popped into my head? And how true it became. Surely we should be able to charge Starmer with treason, says Sheila. The definition of a treason includes any acts which undermine the security and stability of the UK and any that aids foreign powers. Although his lefty judiciary would no doubt prevent that. What a state we're in. 4 more years of Labour is too long. We won't be worth saving by then. Looking forward to the next rocket of right thinking. All the best, Sheila. And here's Allison, no relation. Dear Planet Normal, Keir Starmer's betrayal of this country, the Brexit vote and his manifesto comments in this new deal with the EU is shameful, but was only to be expected. I doubt there's a single part of this agreement he doesn't privately endorse. His only concern will have been how to sell it to voters. The true guilt, however, lies with the Conservative parties as Allison and successive prime ministers who failed to properly and speedily deliver what the public voted for. From David Cameron's hissy fit to the pointless Windsor framework, it's been one mess after another. Don't get me started on Theresa May. Most worryingly, it exposed how totally inept this country now is at negotiating in its own interests. I have some reservations about reform, says Allison, and how effective they would be in government. However, with no other party prepared to listen to the electorate or deliver on its manifesto promises, they seem to me like the only game in town. Thank you for all you both do on Planet Normal and elsewhere. Best wishes, Alice.
And Jane says, I like this one. Dear Allison and Liam, I'm currently reading Tracy Borman's biography of Thomas Cromwell, and I was struck by one section referring to a time when Cromwell was coming down hard on anyone having the temerity to criticise the king. And Jane quotes from the book. The court records for 1535 contain numerous cases against ordinary men and women having uttered derogatory words against their monarch, which were then twisted into treason. The punishments for these misdemeanours were terrifyingly harsh. If the authorities deemed that the words had been seditious, the perpetrators could be put to death. Henry's subjects could no longer express their opinions, even if they did not act upon them without fear of reprisal. I'll leave it there, says Jane, for fear of being seen as too Brexity. You'll have the police around soon, Jane, with that kind of attitude. As they say in the Fast Show, you ain't seen me, right? Thanks as always for flying the flag of sanity. And Giles says, Thank you for yet another excellent Planet Normal podcast, highlighting with such clarity the ever-growing list of trouble facing our country. Oh, how we need you and your guests every week to give us the voice of reason and common sense and drown out the rubbish that emanates from various other political podcasts hosted by the Bleeding Heart Liberal Brigade. Can't think what you're referring to, Giles. At the end of this podcast, you jokingly mentioned that the next Reform government could have Liam as the Chancellor, Lord David Frost as Foreign Secretary, and Allison as Minister for Deportations. Perhaps it wasn't so tongue-in-cheek after all. Are you both going to stand at the next election? But when that election does finally come, says Giles, and Reform will surely do very well, if not win a majority, one thing I'm really looking forward to in the new Parliament is having a majority of Reform MPs who've actually lived and worked in the real world. People who've worked in business, in the health service, in foreign diplomacy, in the armed forces, in the emergency services, etc. Even journalists. Steady on, Giles, steady on. I'm sick of the country being run by career politicians and lawyers who for many years have got us to where we are now, relying on so-called think tanks and focus groups because they've got no idea what they're doing. That's no way to govern a country. We need people with experience and conviction. Enough of the ideological student politics, as epitomised by Starmer, Rayner, Phillipson, Reeves and Miliband, et al., who we have to endure currently. Best wishes, Giles. P.S. I didn't hear you say no to standing at the next election. Oh, watch this space, Giles. Watch this space.
And finally, Alison, Larry Limerick, dear Planet Normalers, 2 subjects grabbed my attention in your last episode. First, the Lucy Connelly case. Like many people, I take the view she may not have been prosecuted or found guilty at all if she'd not pleaded guilty, but that once she'd pleaded guilty, a few weeks' community service would have been proportionate. But perhaps it's time the Rocket got to grips with the root cause of cases like the Connelly one. A large part of that is legislation, old and new, being used to bring these prosecutions and the associated sentencing guidelines. Perhaps Planet Normal could spark a campaign to repeal, reform, or simplify these laws. Perhaps you could have a legal expert on the podcast to suggest what can be done. Secondly, the idea was floated by the superior economist on the Rocket.
Oh, who's that?
That reform might get an overall majority at the next general election. I'm no John Curtis, but this strikes me as radically underestimating the importance of local organisation and electoral success, especially when resources are spread thin at a general election, and the street fighting capabilities of the Conservatives and Labour. Getting from 5 to 326 MPs, says Larry Limerick, would be water into wine territory. We therefore come back to the possibility of a pre-election pact between the Conservatives and Reform. If we don't get that, I believe we'll likely end up with some hideous left-wing coalition after the next election, made up of Labour and the Lib Dems and maybe the resurgent SNP, more ideological net zero obsessive and energy policy, more crazy borrowing, no meaningful cuts to the welfare state, pork barrel spending on stilts, says Larry. It's a depressing thought. The right must unite, he says. And finally, true to his name, he says, a limerick. There once was a lord called Frost who insisted all is not lost. The planet ran chemi, and knowing the real enemy, his skills were used, never mind the cost. Larry Limerick's onto something. There's a lot of people at the top of the Tories who are watching Lord David Frost extremely closely, Alison.
They certainly are.
Which is why our interview with him last week was so widely noticed across the political spectrum. And on that bombshell, that's it from Planet Normal for another week. As we leave our sanctuary of sweet reason, our flying refuge of reasoned views, email of the week, it's my turn. And I think it has to be Jane, if only because she reminded us all of the difference between Thomas Cromwell and Oliver Cromwell. Always important distinction. So Jane, send us an email to planetnormal@telegraph.co.uk, put mug winner in the subject heading, give us your postal address, and a Planet Normal mug will wing its way to you.
If you enjoy Planet Normal, please subscribe to this podcast and do leave us a rating and a review on Spotify, the podcast app, or wherever you listen. It does help other people to find us so the marvellous Planet Normal family can grow.
And as we speed away from our beloved Planet Normal, the madness of planet Earth comes back into view. Thanks as ever to our producers, Cass Ho, James Hodgson, welcome to you, James, and indeed Louisa Wells. Stay safe and in touch with us and with each other. Until next week, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.